So, what if I told you that the greatest, most celebrated genius of all of English literature was actually just a massive copycat?
Oh, wow,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, right? Think about William Shakespeare for a second. We treat him like this, this unparalleled fountain of original genius.
Right.
But what if almost none of his famous plots were actually his?
Yeah, that's a huge thing to wrap your head around.
It is. So today we're looking at how the most famous writers in history barely invented any of their own stories. And why that so-called theft is actually the secret mechanism behind how all entertainment works.
Yeah, and it completely upends how we're taught to think about art.
Mm.
Like we have this really romanticized image of the solitary
Right,
genius.
just sitting at a typewriter in a cabin somewhere.
Exactly, just pulling a completely original universe out of thin air.
Yeah.
But the reality is, well, it's far more practical and honestly a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I always think about it like reading a book or watching a movie is like playing with building blocks.
Okay, yeah.
Usually there's this expectation of invention, right? You take a pile of plastic bricks, and the goal is to mold a completely new shape that nobody has ever seen before.
Right, right.
But this realization about Shakespeare makes me wonder, what if we never actually get new blocks?
Oh, I see where you're going.
What if, instead of inventing new pieces, authors are just taking the exact same old blocks, like the same red squares, the same blue rectangles from centuries ago, and just rearranging them over and over again to build new castles?
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
And the book we're diving into today, it's called Adaptation and Appropriation by Julie Sanders. And it argues that this is exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
It is the absolute definition of a cultural recycling program.
A recycling program, I like that.
Yeah, we're constantly reusing the past to make sense of the present. And once you understand the tools writers use to do this, well, you start seeing the old blocks hidden inside the new castles pretty much everywhere.
Which is exactly why, why you, the listener, should care about this.
Hmm.
Because every movie you watch, every song you stream, or every paperback you read on the beach is probably secretly connected to an older story.
Absolutely.
Knowing this completely changes how you consume media. Suddenly, you aren't just watching a teen comedy. You are watching a 400-year-old conversation.
Yeah, it adds so many layers to it.
It does. But before we get into the weeds here, I need to state our specific mission for this deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the source book by Julie Sanders is brilliant. It's illuminating, but it is also a very dense academic text filled with very big, heavy, complicated words.
It definitely is. It's written for academics.
Right. So my mission today is to be the bouncer at the door of this conversation.
Oh.
Yeah. We are going to break down these huge concepts using the absolute simplest words possible, no confusing jargon allowed, plain everyday English only.
I happily accept the challenge. I mean, stripping away the academic language is actually, a phenomenal exercise in getting to the core of what these concepts really mean in practice.
Right. It grounds it.
Exactly. It forces us to look at the mechanics of storytelling rather than just the high-level theory.
Good. So let's start with the basic mechanics. The book splits this whole idea of reusing stories into two main buckets, right? Adaptation and appropriation.
Right.
Now, to me, those sound like synonyms. Like, if I adapt a story, aren't I appropriating it?
Well, they do sound similar, yeah, but the intention behind them is entirely different.
Okay.
Think of it as the difference between borrowing your friend's car to run an errand versus taking your friend's car, painting it neon pink, swapping out the engine, and entering it in a demolition derby.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a big difference.
Right, so let's start with adaptation. In the simplest terms, this is usually about changing a story's format while trying to maintain its original spirit.
So, taking a popular fantasy novel and turning it into a big-budget streaming series?
Exactly. Or taking a famous stage play and turning it into a movie musical. When a creator adapts a work, they generally want to stay close to the original feeling.
Right.
They want the audience to recognize the source material and feel a sense of comfort. They might update the time period or change the setting to make it easier for a modern audience to digest, but they're ultimately paying a polite homage to the original story.
Okay, yeah.
The author of our source text suggests that adaptation is really about prolonging the pleasure you felt when you first encountered that story.
I see. Okay, so adaptation is friendly.
Yes.
It is an affectionate, respectful translation from one medium to another. It wants you to feel that warm glow of nostalgia.
Precisely.
But appropriation sounds a lot more aggressive.
It is much more aggressive. It is essentially a hostile takeover of a story.
A hostile takeover.
Yeah. When an author appropriates a narrative, They take the old story, but they deliberately change its core meaning.
Oh, okay.
They do this to actively argue with the original text or to expose a totally different, sometimes much darker, side of it.
Right.
They aren't trying to prolong your pleasure at all. They're trying to shake you up, disrupt your expectations, and make you question what you thought you knew about those characters. It relies heavily on a complex process of intertextuality and bricolage.
Whoa. Blow the whistle. Bouncer mode activated right there.
Oh, right.
I warned you about this. Intertextuality, bricolage. Those are exactly the kind of heavy textbook terms we banned at the door.
Oh, my apologies. Fair enough.
Let's start with bricolage. Explain that in simple words, please.
Yeah, okay. So bricolage is a French word that translates roughly to do-it-yourself.
Okay, DIY.
Exactly. In the context of art and literature, it simply means making something new out of random, available old parts.
Like a collage.
Like a collage, exactly. Think of it like making a collage out of old magazine scraps. You cut out a picture of a sleek sports car from one page, a picture of a golden retriever from another, and a picture of a stormy ocean from a third, and you paste them all together to make a totally surreal new image. You are using scraps of old, familiar stories to build a new one.
That makes total sense. A DIY story collage.
Yeah.
So if I am tracking this correctly, an adaptation is like a local band making a really polite, faithful cover of a classic Beatles song.
Right.
They want you to sing along.
Yeah.
But appropriation is like taking that same classic Beatles song, keeping the familiar melody, but changing all the lyrics to aggressively mock the original singer's political views.
That cover band versus parody band analogy is a perfect way to look at it. The cover band wants you to feel nostalgic. The parody band wants you to realize the original singer was actually kind of ridiculous or flawed.
Right.
Both are heavily utilizing the original song, but their ultimate goals are complete opposites.
Which brings us back to my opening question, I think. You can't really talk about reusing stories or, building blocks without talking about the biggest story provider of all time.
Oh, absolutely.
The ultimate pile of raw material, William Shakespeare.
Yes. He is undeniably the most adapted author in human history.
Yeah.
His plays have been transformed into literally everything you can imagine, from classical ballets to science fiction movies to high school teen comedies.
Right.
But the twist that Julie Sanders points out in her book is that Shakespeare himself was fundamentally a collage artist.
It just feels so counterintuitive, We are taught that Hamlet and Macbeth are the absolute peak of original human invention.
Right. But in his era, the concept of a completely original plot just wasn't prized the way it is today.
Really?
Yeah, copying was just how art was generated. Shakespeare frequently took ancient Roman myths, specifically from a writer named Ovid, along with old historical chronicles of British kings, and he just reused them.
Wow.
He took those existing blocks and rearranged them. He almost never came up with a narrative arc entirely out of his own imagination.
It's just turtles all the way down. We're currently adapting a guy who was already adapting guys from 1,000 years before him. Let us look at how modern creators have adapted Shakespeare, because the examples in this book really clarify the difference between just changing the window dressing and actually changing the foundation.
Okay, yeah.
Let's start with moving in time and space, which falls under adaptation, not appropriation, right?
Yes.
Okay.
This is where you keep the original emotional core but change the setting. The classic example the book explores is Romeo and Juliet.
Sure.
At its heart, it's a story about two teenagers from wealthy rival families in Verona who fall in love, are kept apart by ancient hatred, and die tragically.
Right.
In the 1950s, this blueprint was adapted into the iconic stage musical West Side Story.
And what makes West Side Story such a successful adaptation is how perfectly it maps the old blocks onto a new environment.
It maps them seamlessly. They traded the wealthy Renaissance families for rival street gangs in New York City, the Jets and the Sharks.
Right.
The weapons changed from elegant swords to brutal switchblades. The dialogue changed to 1950s street slang and musical numbers.
Yeah.
But the core tragedy, that senselessness of inherited hatred, remains absolutely intact.
Right.
Then, if we jump forward to 1996, the director Baz Luhrmann adapted it again for his movie William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet.
Oh man, that movie was a cultural reset for anyone who grew up in the 90s.
Definitely.
He set it in this hyper-modern, neon-lit, fictional beach city. But the craziest part was that instead of changing the words to match the modern setting, he kept Shakespeare's original Elizabethan dialogue.
Which creates a fascinating visual tension. You have characters driving convertibles, wearing Hawaiian shirts, and getting into gas station shootouts, but they are speaking in 400-year-old poetry.
Yeah.
They are shouting about swords and long swords, but they are holding semi-automatic handguns.
I always wondered how they got away with that without the audience just laughing at the disconnect. Like, it seems so absurd on paper.
It does. But to bridge that gap, Luhrmann used visual poetry. He made Sword the manufacturing brand name of the gun.
Ah,
Yeah, the camera actually zooms in on the metal barrel of the firearm. And the word sword, 9mm, is engraved right there on the metal.
that is so cool.
It's an incredibly clever loophole to bridge the centuries without altering a single word of the original text.
Yeah.
It's a pure adaptation. It brings the story closer to our modern visual language while preserving the author's exact voice.
That is such a smart detail.
Okay.
So that is adaptation. That is the respectful cover song.
Right.
What does it look like when a writer decides to appropriate Shakespeare? When they decide to execute the hostile takeover?
So for a prime example of appropriation, the book points to a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Jane Smiley called 1,000 Acres.
Okay.
She took Shakespeare's massive, culturally monumental play King Lear and completely hijacked it.
Hijacked it how?
Well, in the original play, King Lear is an aging, powerful monarch who decides to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters.
Right.
2 of the daughters flatter him and get the land, then immediately turn on him. Lear goes mad, wandering in a storm, raging against his ungrateful children. The play is entirely focused on his tragic fall from power. The 2 older daughters are basically just cartoon villains.
Right. They exist purely to be evil, so the audience feels sympathy for this old man losing his grip on reality.
Exactly. But Jane Smiley takes that exact plot and completely flips the perspective. She moves the setting to a massive, modern American farm in Iowa.
Oh, wow.
Instead of focusing on the aging patriarch, she focuses on his oldest daughter, Jenny. She makes Ginny the narrator of the entire novel.
So we are suddenly hearing the entire story from the perspective of the classic villain.
Yes. And when you experience the events through Ginny's eyes, the entire moral landscape of the story shifts. You suddenly realize why she and her sister were so cold and angry toward their father.
Wait, why were they?
Smiley carefully weaves in a backstory of severe generational abuse and manipulation that fully explains the daughter's harsh actions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It completely changes the meaning of the narrative. You stop viewing the father as a tragic hero and start seeing him as a tyrant. You stop seeing the daughters as monsters and start understanding their deep trauma.
That's intense.
It is. That is appropriation.
Hmm.
It actively argues with Shakespeare. It looks back at the 400-year-old classic and says, you left out the most important part of the story.
That completely flips the script.
Yeah.
But it does make me ask a somewhat cynical question.
Okay, go ahead.
If we just keep telling the exact same stories, century after century, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, aren't we just admitting that we are out of new ideas? Like, is literature just creatively bankrupt?
It's a very common complaint, especially when you look at movie theaters full of sequels and reboots. But this book argues something entirely different.
What's that?
Using an old famous story isn't about being lazy. It's about utilizing a cognitive shortcut.
A shortcut? How does borrowing a plot save time?
Think about how much heavy lifting a writer has to do when they build a brand new world from scratch. You have to introduce a protagonist, explain their background, introduce the antagonist, establish the rules of the universe, and slowly build the tension.
Right, the setup.
Exactly. It can take 100 pages just to get the reader oriented. But if a writer bases their story on the blueprint of Romeo and Juliet, the audience instantly knows the underlying structure.
Yeah, that's true.
Within 5 minutes, they know there are 2 factions that hate each other, 2 young people who will fall in love across enemy lines, and a tragedy waiting at the end.
I see. Because the audience already knows the architecture of the building, the writer can skip the boring construction phase.
Precisely the point. They get to skip the tedious setup and jump straight into making their new argument. They could spend all their creative energy on the variations, the new flavor, the new political or social message they want to deliver.
Right.
The audience is already doing half the work by remembering the original story, which frees the author to be incredibly inventive with the details.
It is not a lack of imagination. It's actually a highly efficient delivery system for new ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
And that perfectly sets up our next exploration, which is all about why writers choose to take over these old stories. It usually comes down to wanting to correct the historical record.
Yeah, building on that idea of changing the point of view, like we saw with 1,000 Acres, many modern writers look back at the canon of classic literature and realize that massive groups of people were completely left out of the narrative.
Right.
The classic books we study in school were overwhelmingly written by men, usually wealthy men, and usually from nations that were busy colonizing other parts of the world.
So anyone who didn't fit that narrow demographic was either ignored entirely or just used as a silent background prop to make the main character look better.
Right. Which is why a huge portion of literary appropriation is driven by two major academic frameworks. The source text leans heavily into feminism and post-colonialism as the main engines for rewriting classic books.
Stop right there.
Uh-oh, the bouncer's back.
Yeah.
Yep.
I know feminism and post-colonialism aren't the most obscure academic words out there, but they can still sound like a college syllabus.
Sure. Right.
If we were sitting at a bar explaining this to a friend, how do we define what these authors were actually trying to do?
Well, let's keep it grounded, yeah.
Yeah.
In the context of this book, the feminist approach simply means looking at the women's side of the story.
Okay.
It's about giving a microphone to female characters who were silenced, stereotyped, or treated as objects in the original classic books.
Makes sense.
And the post-colonial approach simply means looking at the side of the people whose lands were taken over. It's about giving a voice to the native populations or the conquered people, who are usually just treated as savages or exotic background scenery by classic British or European authors.
That clarifies it perfectly.
Yeah.
And just to pause here for our listeners, we are discussing these frameworks because they are the explicit motivations described by Julie Sanders in our source book.
Yeah.
We aren't taking a political stance or endorsing a specific ideology here. Our goal is simply to unpack why these modern authors felt compelled to rewrite these specific classics, according to the research we are analyzing.
Right, an important boundary to set. We're simply observing the tools the artists use to dismantle the old blocks.
Exactly.
And one of the most famous tools of this kind of feminist appropriation is a novel called Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice. It is a brilliant, complete takeover of the classic 19th century novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte.
Oh, Jane Eyre is the ultimate classic romance.
Yeah.
You have the poor, plain governess who goes to work at a spooky mansion and falls in love with her brooding, wealthy employer, Mr. Rochester.
That is the surface narrative, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a massive dark secret at the center of Jane Eyre.
Right, the attic.
Exactly. Mr. Rochester actually has a wife that he keeps literally locked away in the attic of his mansion because he claims she has gone completely mad.
Yeah.
In Bronte's original book, this woman, whose name is Bertha, is practically depicted as a feral monster. She snarls, she bites, she sets fires.
She basically only exists as a terrifying obstacle to keep Jane and Rochester apart.
Right. She has no voice, no real humanity, and no side of the story. She's just a plot device known as the mad woman in the attic.
Which, you know, if you step back from the romance of it, is a profoundly disturbing situation to just gloss over.
Jean Rice certainly felt it was disturbing, so she wrote Wide Sargasso Sea to explain exactly who this woman was before she was locked in a cold English attic.
Oh.
She restores the character's real name, Antoinette. The novel explores her vibrant, complex life in the Caribbean.
Okay.
It details how Rochester traveled there, married her primarily for her substantial inheritance, completely misunderstood her culture, brought her to freezing, dreary England, stripped away her identity, and systematically drove her to paranoia and desperation.
It takes this character, who is essentially a haunted house sound effect, and turns her into a deeply tragic, fully realized human being.
Yes.
I love the analogy we touched on earlier. It's exactly like a court case.
Oh yeah, the courtroom analogy.
Yeah, the classic book, Jane Eyre, was only letting one witness speak to the jury. Mr. Rochester got to take the stand, point at the attic, and say, "Look how crazy she is, feel sorry for me."
Oh, Mr. Rochester.
Exactly. But Jean Rice is acting like the defense attorney. She is calling the other witness to the stand, demanding the jury hear what happened before she got locked in that room.
It's a compelling way to frame it. And that exact same courtroom dynamic applies to the post-colonial examples detailed in the book.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Take Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. It is widely considered the ultimate survival story. A resourceful Englishman stranded on a remote desert island who eventually takes on a native servant he names Friday.
Right, everybody knows that story.
But the South African author J.M. Coetzee rewrote that entire mythos in a book called Foe.
So what witness did Coetzee call to the stand to disrupt the survival myth?
He fundamentally alters the ecosystem of the island by inserting a woman's point of view that was totally missing from the original text.
Oh.
He introduces a female castaway named Susan Barton. And through her eyes, we see a vastly different, much more critical version of Crusoe and his relationship with Friday.
I see.
It strips away the noble, heroic veneer of the original story and questions the harsh realities of power and subjugation on that island.
It's like looking at a famous, beautiful painting from behind the canvas. You suddenly see all the messy staples, the splinters, and the rough edges that hold the illusion together.
Exactly.
The book mentions another classic Victorian novel that gets this treatment right.
Yes, another striking example is Jack Maggs by the Australian author Peter Carey. He takes on the monumental Charles Dickens novel Great Expectations.
Okay, I remember reading that one.
So in Dickens's original book, there is a terrifying escaped criminal named Magwitch who unexpectedly provides a fortune to help the young hero, Pip.
Right, the benefactor.
Right. While Magwitch has a redemption arc, he's primarily a plot device to move the hero's journey forward. But Peter Carey writes his entire novel from the perspective of the criminal.
Oh, wow.
He shows the brutal, dehumanizing reality of the 19th century English prison system and what it actually meant to be a convict exiled to Australia. He calls the criminal to the witness stand to testify against the society that created him.
It really proves that artists aren't just reusing these stories because they can't think of anything else. They are doing it to correct the historical and cultural record.
Yes.
They are filling in the deliberate blanks left by previous generations, which leads us to a fascinating pivot in our discussion. We know writers borrow from old fiction, but the source text shows they also borrow from reality. They appropriate real history.
They do. And this is where the boundary between historical fact and fictional metaphor gets very slippery. Authors frequently take a real historical event or a famous real-life person and turn them into a symbol to talk about a completely different, often highly sensitive modern issue.
Now, I can see how you'd adapt a fictional story, but taking a real historical event seems incredibly risky. Like, if I write a play about the Salem witch trials of 1692, people are just going to assume it's a dry history lesson about colonial America.
Right, but that is exactly the camouflage Arthur Miller used when he wrote his famous play, The Crucible.
Oh, right.
On the surface, it is a painstakingly researched play strictly about those Salem witch trials, where mass paranoia swept through a Puritan village and innocent people were hanged based on wild accusations.
An event that is entirely rooted in historical fact.
Rooted in fact, yes.
Yeah.
But the context of when it was written is the key. Arthur Miller wrote the play in the early 1950s.
Right.
This was during a period in the United States known as the Red Scare, when the government, heavily influenced by Senator Joseph McCarthy, was aggressively hunting down suspected communists.
Oh, I see where this is going.
People were terrified, neighbors were turning on neighbors, and entire careers in Hollywood and Washington were being destroyed based on mere rumors and unproven accusations of disloyalty.
I see the parallel. Miller used the history of the 1690s as a costume to critique the 1950s.
Precisely.
And again, just to maintain our boundary for our listeners, we are remaining completely politically neutral here regarding the historical debates of the McCarthy era. The academic framework here simply suggests that Miller couldn't write a play directly attacking the government without risking being blacklisted himself.
Right, he had to be careful.
So the history of Salem became his armor.
The historical facts became the building blocks for a modern argument about mass hysteria.
Yeah.
Another fascinating and perhaps more intimate example of appropriating a real life is Joyce Carol Oates' massive novel Blonde.
Okay.
It is a heavily fictionalized account of the life of Marilyn Monroe. But Oates makes a very specific, deliberate stylistic choice throughout the book. She almost never uses real names for the famous men in Monroe's life.
Wait, she writes a 700-page biographical novel about one of the most famous women in the world, but refuses to name her incredibly famous husbands.
Exactly. Instead of naming the legendary baseball player she married, or the famous playwright, or the politician she had an affair with, Oates calls them titles like the ex-athlete, or the playwright, or the president.
Why?
By stripping away their specific names, she turns them into universal archetypes. It stops being just a gossipy biography about specific celebrities and becomes a broader cultural story about how powerful, wealthy men systematically consumed and destroyed this vulnerable woman.
Wow.
And here is where the book introduces a literary concept called cynic.
Cynic, what? Nope, not gonna happen.
Oh, come on.
Hit the brakes. I heard the start of that word and my bouncer instincts kicked in. We were absolutely not using whatever that word was today. Translate that concept for me.
You got me right on the edge there. Okay, the word I was about to use simply means using one tiny piece of an object to stand in for the whole entire thing.
Okay, give me an example of how we do that in normal conversation.
Well, if you buy a brand new sports car, you might pull up to your friend's house and say, hey, come outside and check out my new wheels. You aren't literally just asking them to admire the rubber tires. The word wheels is a shortcut that represents the entire expensive car.
That makes perfect sense. So how does that concept apply to this massive novel about Marilyn Monroe?
In Blonde, a single piece of peroxide blonde hair is constantly used to represent the whole tragic, manufactured myth of Marilyn Monroe.
Oh.
That one visual element, the unnatural striking blonde hair, stands for all the studio pressure, the crushing fame, the loss of her true identity as Norma Jean, and the profound sadness of her entire life. It's a shortcut, just like using an old Shakespeare plot is a shortcut.
That is incredibly potent. You can appropriate an entire complex human life and reduce it to one vivid symbol to make a sweeping point about fame.
Exactly.
But the source text points out that this kind of appropriation isn't limited to books and plays. Visual art gets reused all the time too, right?
Yeah. Constantly. The photographer Cindy Truman built her career on this. She took a famous series of photographs where she dressed up and meticulously posed herself to look exactly like the subjects of classic, renowned paintings by old European masters like Caravaggio.
Okay.
She literally inserted her own modern female body into the sacred history of male-dominated art.
Which forces the viewer to look at the old painting in a completely new way. You can't just passively admire the brushstrokes anymore because now there is a modern woman staring back at you controlling the camera.
Exactly.
But wait, this brings up a massive complication.
Oh, what's that?
If she is posing exactly like an old painting, or to use another example from the book, Madonna famously copying Marilyn Monroe's exact look, the pink dress, the diamonds, the choreography for the Material Girl music video.
Right, iconic.
Yeah, if you are copying someone else's exact image or their exact plot, where are the copyright police? Isn't this just legally stealing?
Well, this raises a very thorny question,
Hmm.
and it's a massive debate within the source text.
I imagine so.
The core argument is this. If art is always fundamentally built by copying and adapting older art, if Shakespeare copied Ovid, if Jean Roots copied Bronte, if Madonna copied Marilyn, then having incredibly strict punishing copyright laws might actually freeze human creativity entirely.
Huh.
If you aren't legally allowed to play with the old building blocks, then how do you ever build anything new?
That is a dangerous, fascinating line to walk. It feels like walking a tightrope between paying a beautiful tribute and committing intellectual theft.
It does.
Which leads us perfectly into our final major exploration today. The plagiarism trap versus the matrix of possibilities. How do we actually define the line between stealing and adapting?
The book uses a very controversial real-world example to explore this tension. A British writer named Graham Swift wrote a novel called Last Orders, and it was so acclaimed that it won the Booker Prize, which is a massive, prestigious literary award.
Okay, good for him.
But shortly after the celebrations, a wave of fury hit the literary community.
Oh no, what happened?
Critics realized his book had the exact same structure, the exact same alternating points of view, and a core plot about a group of people carrying a dead body across the country to be laid to rest, as a very famous older book by the American author William Faulkner called As I Lay Dying.
Oh wow, that is not just a subtle nod. That is taking the entire architectural blueprint. Did the author just admit he copied it?
He defended it by calling it an homage, a tribute to a master writer.
Right.
But many critics flat out called it plagiarism. They argued he was intellectually dishonest for not explicitly stating on page 1 or in a foreword that he was borrowing Faulkner's entire foundation.
So who does the book say is right? Is it theft or is it tribute?
Well, the source text argues that getting bogged down in the word stealing completely misses the point of how culture actually evolves.
Okay.
The book offers two much more useful frameworks to think about this, borrowing metaphors from outside the world of literature.
I like metaphors.
The first is a musical metaphor.
I am much more comfortable with music metaphors. How does it work?
Think about the tradition of jazz music. In a jazz club, it is incredibly common, even expected, for a musician to play a riff, which means they take a famous old tune that everyone in the room knows by heart, but they add their own fresh, improvised, unexpected spin to it.
Right, yeah.
Or think about the foundation of hip-hop. The entire genre was built on the concept of sampling, taking a recognizable drum beat or a vocal hook from a classic 1970s soul record, and rapping brand new lyrics over it.
And nobody in a jazz club stands up, points at the saxophone player, and yells, "Hey, you stole those notes." They inherently understand that it's an ongoing conversation.
Precisely. It is an active conversation with the past. When a hip-hop producer samples a James Brown drum break, they aren't trying to trick you into thinking they invented that drum beat this morning.
Right.
They want you to recognize it. They want you to feel the groove of the past and then appreciate the new poetry and the modern struggle they're layering on top of it.
That completely reframes the Graham Swift controversy. He wasn't stealing Faulkner. He was sampling Faulkner to tell a new story about modern England.
Exactly.
Okay, love that. What is the second metaphor the book uses?
The science metaphor. The book looks at Charles Darwin, evolutionary biology, and the concept of DNA.
Biology now. Keep it simple for the bouncer, please.
I will keep it very simple, I promise. Think about how plants reproduce and grow. Just like different plant genes combine and mutate to make a new, unique flower that has never existed before, fragments of old stories combine and mutate to make a new story.
But wait, if I copy a plant's DNA perfectly, a copy is still just a copy, right?
Not in the grand scheme of nature. In nature, if you have an exact 100% perfect copy, that is a clone.
Okay.
A clone is static that doesn't change. But a genetic adaptation, where elements mix, mutate, and change based on their surroundings, well, that creates something new that might actually survive better in a new, changing environment.
Wow. Let me try to translate that back to the books we've been talking about.
Go for it.
If I sit down and rewrite Romeo and Juliet word for word exactly as Shakespeare wrote it, I haven't created anything. I've made a clone. It's static.
Yeah.
But if I mix the DNA of Romeo and Juliet with the DNA of a 1950s street gang in New York dealing with immigration and poverty, I get West Side Story.
Yes.
It is a genetic adaptation. It survives better in the new cultural environment of 1950s America than a play about guys in tights ever could.
You have absolutely nailed the core concept of the book. That is the biological essence of cultural adaptation.
This completely changes how I think about creativity, because it means that originality doesn't mean sitting in an empty, silent room and desperately trying to pull something out of nothing, which is probably impossible anyway.
It usually is.
True originality means taking the old, available building blocks and mixing those ancient parts in a configuration that no one has ever seen before.
It actually relieves a massive amount of pressure for any creator, doesn't it? You don't have to invent the universe to tell a good story. You just have to have a unique, personal conversation with the universe of stories that already exists.
It really does.
Yeah.
So let's recap this deep dive, keeping strictly to our rule of using the simplest words possible.
Okay, let's hear it.
What we have uncovered today is that artists are not just running out of ideas. Hollywood isn't creatively bankrupt just because they make another Batman movie.
Right.
Instead, creators are actively building a giant, invisible web of connected stories. Every single time they rewrite a classic, whether it is giving the silenced woman in the attic a microphone or dressing a 16th century tragedy in neon lights and modern street clothes, they are giving us a new lens to view our own world. They were building a structurally new shape out of the exact same old blocks.
And that dense web of recycled, adapted stories is quite literally what holds our culture together across centuries.
Yeah.
But if we want to leave the listener with a final thought drawn from Julie Sanders' research, we have to look at the very last piece of this puzzle. The book argues that without the reader, without the audience, this whole massive web of adaptation completely falls apart.
Why? If the book is printed, isn't the adaptation finished?
Because you, the person listening to this deep dive right now, the person reading the paperback, the person sitting in the dark movie theater, you are actually the final adapter.
The audience is the final adapter.
Yes, because a story isn't actually finished when the author prints the final page or the director yells cut. It is only finished when you experience it.
Oh.
You bring your own specific memories, your own simple words, your own unacknowledged biases, and your own unique life experiences to everything you watch and read. The story mutates and changes one last time inside your own head. You are the final piece of the DNA mixing with the story.
That is a staggering thought. The castle of blocks literally looks different depending on whose brain is processing it.
Exactly.
So the provocative thought we leave you with today to ponder on your own is this. How many stories are you adapting in your own mind right now without even knowing it?
Every time you remember a movie's ending slightly differently than your friend does, or every time you fiercely relate to a flawed character that nobody else seems to like, you are appropriating that story. You are making it uniquely yours.
You are building your own castle. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you read a book or watch a movie, look for the blocks. They're everywhere.